Welcome back to Family Ties and Lies, the channel where blood is thicker than water, but secrets are the thickest of all. Every family has a perfect smile for the cameras, but what happens when the doors finally close? We know that behind every flawless holiday dinner lies a hidden web of deception waiting to unravel. Here, we dig into the most shocking family dramas, bitter betrayals, and dark mysteries that people try to bury forever. Whether it is a brutal feud or a hidden past, we uncover the absolute truth. Grab your snack, get comfortable, and hit that subscribe button right now. The ultimate family secrets are about to be exposed. My sister forged my signature so perfectly that even the bank could not tell the difference. $520,000 of debt, registered under my name, attached to a company I had never created. She had learned how I signed my name by watching me do it across the kitchen table for 26 years of marriage to the man she eventually took from me. This is how I found out, and this is what I did about it. It started on a Tuesday morning in August, tucked between a water bill and a grocery store coupon. I almost missed it entirely. My hands were dusted with flour at the time. I had a batch of biscuits warming in the oven, the kind my granddaughter Harper loved with too much butter, and a thin ribbon of honey pressed into the top. She was coming over that Sunday the same as every Sunday, and my kitchen already carried that particular smell that arrives before good company does warm dough and cast iron, and the faint sweetness of something almost ready. Outside the window above the sink, my rose garden was doing what it did every August in Charleston, pulling every last drop of color out of a punishing sun and refusing to wilt. I had lived in that small house on the edge of the North Charleston suburbs for 19 years. 4 bedrooms that became 2 after both daughters left. A front porch just wide enough for 2 chairs, and a yard I had planted myself the spring after the divorce. I was 64 years old. My mortgage was paid, and I had exactly the life I had rebuilt quietly from the rubble of a marriage that ended the way mine did. I was not rich. I was settled, which is its own kind of grace. I set the mail on the counter, wiped my hands on my apron, and reached for the envelope at the bottom of the stack. It bore the name of a bank I had never heard of. Not my bank. Not the small credit union on Meeting Street where I had kept my savings for 30 years. This was a commercial lending institution out of Columbia, printed on heavy ivory stock with a logo I did not recognize. I opened it standing right there at the counter. The letterhead read Dorothy Hensley Property Solutions, LLC. The balance listed was $180,000, 90 days past due. I had never formed a company in my life. Not once in 38 years of appraising property across Charleston County had I placed my name on a corporate charter. I had no LLC, no corporate seal, no registered agent on file with the state. Just my name, my license number, and 38 years of a reputation I had never had cause to defend. The smoke alarm went off before I moved again. I had forgotten the biscuits. A second letter arrived the following Thursday. $210,000. A third arrived Saturday morning. $130,000. By the end of that week, A company registered in my name owed $520,000 in defaulted commercial debt across 3 separate lenders. I sat with that number for a long time. The way you sit with something that does not feel real, even after you have read it 4 times. I drove downtown on Monday afternoon and asked to see the loan documentation at the First Bank. The branch manager slid the papers across his desk with the careful manner of someone who had delivered bad news before. I read the documents without speaking, beginning at the top the way I had been trained. The business registration was dated the summer of 2016. The loan applications followed in 2017 and 2018. The collateral listings were vague. The terms were standard. And at the bottom of each document, on the signature line reserved for the authorized representative of Dorothy Hensley Property Solutions, LLC, was my name. I studied the signature carefully. It was nearly perfect. The slight forward lean of the capital D, the way the loop of the lowercase y in Dorothy dropped just a fraction below the baseline, the particular angle at which the capital H was formed. Whoever had written it understood my handwriting, the way you only understand something after watching it for years. After sitting across a kitchen table and observing it on birthday cards and school permission slips and personal checks for 26 years. Wade Hensley had been a real estate attorney. He had been my husband for 26 of those years, and my ex-husband for 8 years after that, right up until the morning 3 months ago when he collapsed on a golf course outside Mount Pleasant and did not get back up. He was buried on a Thursday in April. I sat in the last row of the church because no one had told me I was not allowed to, and also because no one thought to inform me at all. I learned of his death from our old mutual accountant, who sent a 2-sentence email on a Wednesday afternoon. Wade was gone, but here was his work, still drawing interest in my name. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for a long time. The afternoon heat pressed against the glass. The air conditioning ran without making much progress. $520,000 attached to a company I had never touched, a debt I had never agreed to carry, a signature I had never written. I picked up my phone and called my daughter Grace. The line rang 4 times and transferred to voicemail. Her voice, familiar as the sound of my own kitchen, asked me to leave a message after the tone. I did not leave a message. I scrolled down one contact in my phone and stopped. Lenora, my sister. 8 years without a real conversation between us, and yet her name was still saved right below Grace, right where family goes without thinking. I pressed the green icon. The line rang once, only once, and Lenora answered on that first ring, quickly and cleanly, as though she had been sitting somewhere still with the phone already in her hand, waiting for exactly this moment to come. Lenora's voice arrived the way it always did when she wanted something soft and careful, the kind of careful that takes practice to perform correctly. Dorothy, she said. She had called me Dorothy since our mother started doing it, the full name reserved for concern and occasions that required the appearance of gravity. I have been thinking about you all week. How are you feeling? Sweetheart, have you been sleeping? I told her I was fine. I had received unusual mail and needed to understand where it came from. I kept my voice even because I was 64 years old, and I had been keeping my voice even around Lenora for the better part of a decade. She made a small sound, something between a sigh and a murmur, the kind of sound that passes for compassion if you are not paying close attention. Then she said something I had not expected. "I am so relieved you called me," she said. "Grace and I have been talking about you. She mentioned you have not been yourself lately. We are both worried. Dorothy. Are you taking anything for anxiety? Has your doctor mentioned anything about memory?" The parking lot outside the bank was nearly empty. A woman walked past my car pushing a grocery cart, not looking up. I watched her go and did not say anything for a moment. "I am perfectly fine," I said. "I need to ask you about a company registered in my name." There was a pause. Not a long one. But I noticed it the way I notice things after 38 years in this profession. A hairline crack in a load-bearing wall. A pause where there should have been confusion. "Of course," she said gently. "Whatever you need." "Dorothy, I just hope you have been talking to someone. Grace says you have been isolating yourself. That worries me more than I can say." I ended the call shortly after that. I sat in the hot car and let the air conditioning run, without much hope that it would cool the interior. And I thought about a dinner that had taken place 8 years ago on a Thursday evening in late October. Lenora had come to my house that night. She walked through my front door wearing a dress I had given her the previous spring, deep burgundy, from a boutique on King Street. I had made pot roast. I had set the table for 4. Wade was already there and had been there since early evening, standing near the window the way someone stands when they are waiting for something other than dinner to begin. Both my daughters were there when Lenora arrived. Grace was 20 years old, home from college. Bea was 17, sitting in the corner armchair with her legs folded under her, the way she always sat when she was uncomfortable and did not yet know how to leave. Lenora told me in my own living room, before anyone had touched the pot roast. She said she and Wade had been in love for some time and could no longer pretend otherwise. She said love has no blame. She said she hoped I could one day understand. I did not say anything. Grace started crying. Bea stood up from the armchair, walked to the front door, and left without her coat. I set a serving spoon down on the edge of the pot roast dish and drove home to a house that was my home, in a life I had just been told I no longer fit. What I could not have known that evening and had no reason to consider until now was that Lenora had not stumbled into my husband by accident. Grief does not leave much room for analysis. But sitting in that bank parking lot 8 years later, I thought about the timeline for the first time with a clear and uncluttered mind. Lenora had begun helping Wade with his personal bookkeeping approximately 8 months before that October dinner. She offered it as a kindness, a favor between family. Wade had been overwhelmed with a development project that spring, and Lenora, who had always been good with numbers, said she did not mind organizing his quarterlies. I had no objection. She was my sister. He was my husband. There was no reason to object. 8 months. She had been inside his financial records for 8 full months before she told me she loved him. I turned that over in my mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the weight of it, looking at the underside. After the divorce, Lenora did not disappear into the life she had chosen. She remained in Charleston, joined the same congregation we had attended together for 11 years, arriving each Sunday in the pew, 3 rows ahead of mine, as though she had always sat there. She called me every Thanksgiving without fail, her voice warm and patient, inviting me to a dinner she knew I would not attend. She befriended Grace the way someone tends a slow-growing investment. She bought gifts, covered a car repair when Grace was short on money, kept Harper on short notice without complaint. 3 years ago, Grace married a man named Travis Caldwell, a loan officer at a commercial bank in downtown Charleston, a man Lenora had introduced to her at a charity dinner the previous fall. My phone buzzed while I sat watching the sun flatten itself against the asphalt. It was a text message from Grace. It read, "Mom, I love you so much. Please make an appointment to see your doctor. Aunt Lenora told me everything. I am so worried about you. Please call me when you are ready to talk." Lenora had already called her before I had even started the engine. She had called my daughter and delivered her version of the story, complete and coherent and carefully designed, and I had not yet had the chance to say a single word in my own defense. The first rule of any good appraisal is to get there before the property has been staged. Every Wednesday for 4 years, I had parked in the same spot on the east side of Magnolia Avenue Elementary's parking lot, the second space from the end, near the oak tree with the split trunk that the city had been threatening to remove since the previous administration. I knew the crack in the sidewalk outside the front gate. I knew the way the crossing guard adjusted her vest in the afternoon heat. I knew which classroom Harper was in from the sound of the dismissal bell her teacher always let them out 30 seconds early, which meant Harper was usually the first face I saw come through the double doors. That Wednesday, I was there at the usual time. I had left my house at 2:30 in the afternoon, parked in the same spot under the same troubled oak tree, walked up to the front office the way I always did, signed in the way I always did, and waited by the gate the way I had done every Wednesday for 4 years. The woman behind the front desk was someone I had known by name for going on 3 years. She looked at her screen for longer than usual when I checked in, and then she looked up at me with the careful expression of someone who has been asked to deliver bad news to the wrong person. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, "I am so sorry. The authorized pickup list was updated this morning. Your name is no longer on it." I stood at the window for a moment without saying anything. I asked who had made the change. She said it had been requested by the child's parents and that she was not able to share additional details. I thanked her and walked back out through the front door. I stood at the chain-link fence that ran along the front of the school property and waited, because I did not know what else to do and because I was not ready to leave. The dismissal bell rang at 3:15. The double doors opened, and 30-odd children came through them in a wave of backpacks and noise and afternoon energy. I found Harper in the crowd without any effort at all, the way you always find your own. She was wearing the yellow cardigan I had bought her in March, and she had both straps of her backpack on, the way she always wore it when she was excited about something. She came through the doors, scanning the fence line, and when she found my face, she stopped walking for exactly 1 second, and then she started running. I put my hand on the chain-link fence. She was 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. Travis Caldwell came through the doors just behind her. I had met him 11 times. I had counted, not because I distrusted him at first, but because Grace had been slow to bring him around, and each meeting had felt significant. He was a tall man with the kind of steady, managed effect that served him well in his profession. He covered the distance between himself and Harper in 4 long strides and caught her by the hand before she reached the fence. Harper turned and looked at him. She said something I could not hear through the chain link. He said something back and guided her toward the parking lot without looking at me. Harper turned her head over her shoulder once, her free hand lifting in a small wave. Then Travis opened the back door of his car and she got in, and the door closed, and they drove away. I stayed at the fence for a few minutes after they left. The other children were dispersing around me, rushing toward their own people. Someone's grandmother nearly bumped into me. I moved out of the way and walked back to my car. I called Grace from the parking lot. She answered, which surprised me. Her voice was measured in the way a voice gets when someone else is in the room and listening. Travis and I have talked about it, she said. We think it is best if Harper does not spend time with you right now. Mom, just until you get the help you need. We do not want her to be confused by what is happening. I told her nothing was happening. I told her there was a company using my name, and someone had taken out loans in my name, and I needed her to listen to me for 5 minutes. She said she had listened. She said Aunt Lenora had explained everything. She said she was not trying to hurt me. She was trying to protect Harper, and she would call me as soon as I had spoken to a doctor. There was a sound in the background, faint but familiar, the click of a pen, the kind Travis kept in his shirt pocket. He was standing right there. I drove home. The kitchen was the same as I had left it. The afternoon light came through the window above the sink and fell across the counter in a long stripe. Harper's high chair sat at the end of the table where it always sat, pushed in close. The tray wiped clean from the previous Sunday. The mixing bowl I used for biscuit dough was on the second shelf to the left of the stove. It had been in that same spot for 11 years. I made a cup of coffee I did not drink and sat in the kitchen until it was dark outside, and then I went to bed and lay there without sleeping for most of the night. In the morning, there was a letter in the mailbox from the South Carolina Real Estate Appraiser Licensing Board. I carried it inside without opening it first. I made it as far as the kitchen table before I sat down and tore the envelope open and read it straight through. My license, 38 years, gone. The letter from the licensing board was 3 pages long. I read it at the kitchen table the same morning it arrived. while the coffee I had forgotten to drink the previous night sat cold on the counter in its mug. The first page outlined the complaint. The second page detailed the suspension protocols. The third page listed the steps required for reinstatement, beginning with an independent psychological evaluation and ending with a review hearing that the board estimated would not be scheduled for a minimum of 60 days. 60 days without a license meant 60 days without income. I called the licensing board's main line at 8:30 in the morning and was placed on hold for 22 minutes before reaching a representative who told me she could not discuss the specific complaint due to confidentiality protocols. I asked to speak with a supervisor. She transferred me. The supervisor was not available. I left a message. No one returned it. I had 4 months of savings in my checking account. 4 months of the kind of careful, modest living I had been doing for the better part of a decade. Since the divorce, the grocery list managed to the penny. The car paid off 6 years ago. The utilities on budget billing, so nothing surprised me. 4 months was not enough time to fight anything. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after I hung up the phone and stared at the rose garden through the window above the sink. The roses were still doing what they always did in August, holding on with the particular stubbornness of something that has learned the hard way how to survive a dry season. I had planted those roses myself the spring after the divorce. 11 years of blooming without the conditions that were supposed to make it possible. I had been turning something over in my mind since the previous afternoon. The way you turn a problem in the dark, trying to find the part that catches the light, taken separately. Each thing that had happened in the past several days could be explained as misfortune, coincidence, or the natural consequences of a complicated personal situation. The loans could be an administrative error. The pickup list could be a miscommunication. The licensing complaint could be a well-intentioned relative acting out of genuine concern. But placed in sequence, the way I had been trained to read a property inspection report, foundation first, then structure, then surface, the picture was something else entirely. Each event had removed something load-bearing from my life. The loans had threatened my financial standing. The pickup list had removed my access to Harper. The licensing complaint had removed my income and my professional identity in a single letter. Someone was taking this house apart one wall at a time, and I had not yet found the right tool to push back. I spent most of the afternoon making phone calls that went nowhere, drafting a written response to the licensing board that I was not yet sure how to send, and sitting at my kitchen table staring at the list I had started in my notebook the previous evening. By 7 o'clock, I had not eaten, and I had not left the house. I opened my laptop to check my email. There were no emails that required a response. I was about to close the screen when the small red notification circle appeared in the corner of the browser tab I kept open for Facebook, a platform I used infrequently, and mostly to look at photographs of Harper that Grace occasionally posted. I clicked on it. Lenora had uploaded a photograph. It was black and white, old enough to have the softened edges and slightly overexposed quality of a photograph taken before digital cameras existed. 2 little girls sat on the front steps of our childhood home in Somerville. The younger one had her head tilted toward the older one. Their hands were clasped together between them. I recognized the photograph. My mother had kept it in a frame on the hallway bookshelf. I did not know Lenora had a copy. The caption was long. It spoke about the weight of watching someone you love struggle. It spoke about the importance of family and the difficulty of accepting that sometimes love requires hard choices. It used the word prayer 3 times. It ended with a request for anyone who knew our family to hold us in their thoughts during what she called a painful and private season of healing. There were 206 reactions to the post, mostly hearts and small yellow faces with pressed palms. I scrolled through the comments slowly. A woman from our congregation wrote that she was praying for both of us. A neighbor I had known for 12 years wrote that Lenora was the strongest woman he had ever seen. A woman from the book club wrote that mental health was nothing to be ashamed of, and that she hoped I would find the peace I needed. I kept scrolling. I needed to see all of it. Grace had commented 14 hours earlier, which meant she had seen the post before I had, which meant Lenora had told her it was coming. The comment read, "Thank you, Aunt Lenora, for being there when I cannot. I love my mother. I am praying for her every day." I sat with that for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. The screen went dark. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the last of the daylight was pulling back from the rose garden, and the August heat was settling into something cooler and very still. In the morning, a thick envelope was waiting in the mailbox. It bore the seal of the Charleston County Family Court on the upper left corner. Inside was a formal petition for financial guardianship filed under my name. The petitioner was listed as Travis Caldwell. The supporting signature confirming the necessity of the petition belonged to Grace Caldwell. My daughter had signed a document asking a court to take away my reshet to manage my own life. The petition was 41 pages long. I read every one of them. I read them the way I had always read contracts from the first line, without skimming, without assuming I already understood what a word meant based on its placement in a sentence. The document had been prepared by a law firm on Broad Street, with 4 names on the letterhead, the kind of firm that keeps a bowl of mints on the reception counter and charges $400 an hour for phone consultations. Travis had not chosen a small-town notary for this. He had chosen people who do this for a living. The petition described me as exhibiting progressive cognitive decline. It described me as demonstrating persistent financial delusions, inconsistent with documented reality. It described my recent behaviors as consistent with social isolation patterns, common in patients experiencing early-stage neurological deterioration. Every phrase was clinical and careful, and precisely chosen. The language of someone who knew how to build a box out of words and seal a person inside it. If the court granted the petition, I would lose the right to access my own checking account without prior written approval from an appointed guardian. I would lose the right to enter into any contract, including a lease renewal or a utility agreement. I would lose the right to make financial decisions about my own property, the house I had paid off over the course of 30 years, one mortgage payment at a time, through a divorce and 2 daughters and every lean month I had ever managed my way through. I set the petition down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a moment. Then I slid off the chair and sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator, the way I used to sit when the girls were small, and I needed to be at their level to talk to them about something important. The linoleum was cool against the backs of my legs. The refrigerator hummed steadily behind me. I put my hands flat on my thighs and I looked at the kitchen, the way you look at a place you are afraid you might be about to lose. Harper's high chair sat at the end of the table. The mixing bowl was on the second shelf to the left of the stove, where it had been for 11 years. The mold I used for biscuits was hanging on the hook beside the stove window, the one Grace had put up for me the summer she turned 19 and decided I needed more organized kitchen storage. I sat on that floor for what felt like a long time. Then I placed both hands on my knees. I pressed down until my arms straightened. I stood up. I went to the drawer beside the sink where I kept the blue spiral notebook I used for work for recording preliminary observations before I wrote a formal report, for sketching a quick floor plan, for noting a detail I did not want to forget between a site visit and my desk. I sat back down at the kitchen table, opened the notebook to a fresh page, and began writing. I wrote down every event that had occurred since the morning I received the first letter from the bank. I wrote them in order, with dates and times where I had them. I wrote down the sequence of phone calls, the sequence of notifications, the sequence of documents that had arrived at my house. And when I was finished, I looked at the list the way I had looked at thousands of site reports over the course of 38 years, not as a collection of separate incidents, but as a single structure with a single set of intentions behind it. Every blow had been designed to isolate me. The loans had put debt on my name. The pickup list had removed my access to Harper. The licensing complaint had taken my income. The Facebook post had taken my community. The guardianship petition was the last wall. If it went through, it would take my autonomy, my ability to act, to hire, to fight, to access the resources I would need to prove any of this was deliberate. They had not made a single move out of sequence. I thought about June Purcell. Wade's older sister was 71 years old and lived on John's Island in a house that the family referred to as a rental property, the same politely dismissive way they referred to everything about June, her house, her habits, her opinions. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a commercial property management firm in Mount Pleasant for 11 years. She had been careful with money and reliable with records, and by every account I had been given growing up, completely unremarkable until the Christmas she was not. That Christmas, June had arrived at my parents-in-law's house with a stack of ledgers she said proved Wade had transferred escrow funds without authorization. She had been shaking. She had been loud. Within the hour, Wade's mother had called the local precinct and told them June was having a breakdown and making threats. The responding officers had been patient and firm. June had been escorted to her car. The ledgers had been left on the front steps. No one in the family had spoken to June after that. The story, as it was always told, was that June had suffered some kind of episode, something related to her nerves, her isolation, her general difficulty in accepting the realities of a life that had not gone the way she wanted. But I was now sitting at a kitchen table with a guardianship petition that described me in remarkably similar terms. I was not going to call June. Not yet. Before I did anything, I needed to know what I was looking for. I opened my laptop. I typed an email address I had not used in 8 years, the one that belonged to Wade's personal account, the one I had managed alongside our joint finances during the marriage. The password prompt appeared. I typed the 12-character sequence I had asked him to change every year for 26 years. It had never been changed. Wade's inbox had 943 unread messages. I sat with that number for a moment. 943 emails accumulated in an account no one had bothered to close, spreading across 8 years of digital silence like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. The inbox was sorted by date, most recent at the top. The newest messages were automated notifications from banking services and subscription renewals and a credit card company that had apparently been sending monthly statements to a dead man's email address without any indication that the account holder had stopped being able to receive them. I typed his name into the search field. Nothing useful came back. I typed the name of the consulting company, Dorothy Hensley Property Solutions, LLC, and waited while the results loaded. 14 messages returned. The earliest was dated the early months of 2016, several months before the company's official registration date. The sender was Lenora. The subject line read, "Initial Framework," and the body of the message contained a numbered list of steps for establishing a limited liability company in the state of South Carolina, including recommended banks for commercial account opening and a note about which documentation would be required to list a second party as an authorized signatory. She had written it the way a project manager writes to a contractor. There was no greeting. There was no warmth. There was no reference to their personal relationship. No sign-off. Nothing to indicate that the person typing the email had ever sat across a dinner table from the man receiving it. Just steps, in order, with specific action items and a timeline at the bottom. I read through the remaining 13 messages in sequence. Lenora had managed the entire structure of the company, from the initial incorporation to the first loan application. She had selected the lenders. She had formatted the paperwork. She had composed the language used in the loan applications, and she had done so with the precision of someone who had spent time studying how commercial loan officers read applications, what language generated favorable responses, which line items drew scrutiny, and which ones did not. Wade had been the one to sign. His responses to her messages were brief, sometimes a single word. He had functioned as a rubber stamp on a process he had not designed and perhaps not fully understood. I sat back and looked at the screen. Lenora had not helped Wade commit financial fraud. Lenora had committed financial fraud and recruited Wade to provide his signature. Those were not the same thing. I pulled up the earliest message again and read it from the beginning. Then I read the last one. It was dated 4 months before Wade died. Lenora had written exactly one sentence. The third disbursement cleared this morning. No greeting. No closing. Just a transaction confirmation running through a company she had built in my name. I scrolled back to the search bar and typed a new term. I searched for my address, for the name of my neighborhood association, for the name of the street where I had lived for 19 years. No results. I typed Magnolia Pines and pressed enter. One result appeared. It had been filtered into the spam folder by an automated filter, which was the only reason it had survived. It was a booking confirmation from a facility called Magnolia Pines Assisted Living, located on the outskirts of North Charleston. The confirmation was dated 11 weeks ago, 3 weeks before Travis had filed the guardianship petition. The reservation was made in my name. I read the document twice. The confirmed check-in date was listed as 30 days following the scheduled guardianship hearing. The primary contact for the reservation was listed as Travis Caldwell, with a phone number I recognized as his work line at the bank. The billing contact was listed as Lenora Hensley. There was a brochure attached to the confirmation. I opened it. The room they had selected was a single occupancy unit on the ground floor. The photograph showed a narrow bed, a small window, a particle board dresser, and a view that looked directly onto the facility's rear parking lot. The monthly rate was $4,800. At the bottom of the brochure, under the heading for payment arrangements, there was a field that had been filled in by hand. It read sale proceeds from patient's primary residence. They were going to sell my house. They were going to obtain legal guardianship over my finances, sell the house I had paid off over 30 years, and use the money to cover the cost of a room I had never consented to occupy in a facility I had never visited, arranged by a man my daughter had married 3 years ago, and a woman who had spent a decade pretending to love her. My hands were resting on the edge of the laptop keyboard. I noticed they were not shaking. They were still. Not the stillness of someone who has gone numb, but the stillness of something that has just understood the full weight of what it is carrying and has decided not to put it down. I thought about the view from that window, the parking lot, the particle board dresser, the narrow bed. I thought about my rose garden. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone and opened the browser. I typed June Purcell, Johns Island, South Carolina, into the search field. Her name appeared in an old listing from a local directory, an address on a road I recognized as being near the marsh on the southern end of the island, a stretch of low country that most people passed through without stopping. I wrote the address down in my blue spiral notebook in the same even handwriting I used for site reports. I closed the notebook. I stood up from the kitchen table, carried my coffee mug to the sink, and rinsed it. Then I went to bed. Not because I was at peace with any of it, but because a good appraiser knows that you do not walk onto a site in the dark. The drive to Johns Island took 40 minutes in the early morning traffic, moving south out of the city. The road narrowed after the Stono River Bridge, trading the flat commercial sprawl of North Charleston for a different kind of landscape, low-country marshland that sat at water level on both sides of the road, the cordgrass thick and pale gold in the August heat. The live oaks beginning to appear with their canopies draped in long curtains of Spanish moss that caught the morning light and held it at odd angles. I had the address from the directory listing written on the back page of my blue notebook. The road June lived on was not marked on the first 2 map applications I tried. The third gave me a route that required a left turn at a rusted mailbox and a half-mile drive down a dirt lane barely wide enough for 1 car. I drove slowly, watching for the house number painted on a low concrete marker near the property line. June's house was modest, 1 story, white painted clapboard, weathered to a soft gray in places, with a covered front porch just wide enough for a bench, and a collection of terracotta pots growing what appeared to be herbs. A gray tabby cat sat on the porch railing, watching my car approach, with the unhurried suspicion common to cats and people who have learned that most arrivals bring complications. A vegetable garden ran along the left side of the house: tomatoes, squash, something tall I could not identify from the car, the kind of garden that has been tended steadily over many seasons by someone who does not rush. I parked on the shoulder of the lane, stepped out, and walked to the front door. I knocked twice. Footsteps moved inside. A deadbolt disengaged. The door opened, and June Purcell stood in the frame. She was 71 years old and looked it honestly. Dark hair gone almost entirely silver. A face that carried its years without apology. A faded green cardigan worn open over a cotton blouse despite the morning heat. She looked at my face for a moment, and then looked at the blue notebook in my hand with the particular attention of someone who recognizes the purpose of a thing immediately. "I wondered when you would come," she said. Her voice was dry and unhurried. "I just did not think it would take this long." She stepped back from the door and let me in. The interior of the house was small and orderly and smelled of coffee and old paper, and something herbal from the garden outside. A second cat was asleep on the arm of a wing-back chair near the front window. Along the far wall of the living room, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving held dozens of cardboard file boxes, each one labeled in a careful hand with dates and subject headings. This was not the accumulated clutter of someone who could not let things go. This was a filing system. This was a library. June made coffee without asking whether I wanted any. I sat down at the small kitchen table and placed my notebook in front of me and waited. She set 2 mugs on the table, sat down across from me, and looked at me the way people look at you when they have been waiting to have a conversation for a very long time and are making sure you are really there before they begin. I told her what had happened. I told it in order, the way I had written it in my notebook: the letters, the bank visit, the pickup list, the licensing complaint, the Facebook post, the guardianship petition, and the booking confirmation from the assisted living facility. June did not interrupt. She held her coffee mug in both hands and listened with her eyes on the table, nodding occasionally in the way of someone hearing a story that confirms what they already believed to be true. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The escrow accounts," she said. "That is where it started, 15 years ago. Wade was managing a commercial renovation project on Johns Island. The contractor found irregularities in the project account and brought them to me because I was the bookkeeper. I pulled the ledgers. Wade had moved $220,000 out of the project escrow into a personal holding account. The documentation had been altered. His signature on the transfer authorization had been forged, or rather, it had been countersigned in a way that distributed the appearance of authorization across multiple parties, so that no single person appeared wholly responsible. She paused. I brought the ledgers to the Christmas gathering that year because I thought the family would want to know. I thought there would be a conversation. I thought someone would ask Wade to explain himself. Her voice remained even. Instead, his mother called the police before I had finished my second sentence. By the time the officers arrived, I was the one who appeared to be unwell. She stood up and walked to the metal shelving along the far wall. She opened a lower cabinet and removed a flat key from a hook inside the door. She carried the key to a fireproof file box on the lowest shelf, inserted it into the lock, and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 spiral-bound ledgers, each one sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. The dates on the spines covered the period from 2002 through 2009. They called me a crazy hoarder, June said, setting the ledgers on the kitchen table between us. Her voice did not carry bitterness the way I might have expected. It carried the steady quality of someone who has had 15 years to convert grief into something more durable. I am not hoarding, Dorothy. I am preserving evidence. She sat back down and folded her hands around her coffee mug. Now, she said, let me show you what your sister really is. June opened the first spiral-bound ledger to a tabbed section near the middle and laid it flat on the kitchen table between us. The entries were handwritten in a small, precise script that I recognized as the kind of handwriting that belongs to people who spent their formative years writing in ledger books before computer systems made the skill redundant. Each line was dated, each transaction cross-referenced with a document number that corresponded to folders June had stored in the metal shelving unit in the other room. She walked me through the structure without rushing. The ledger covered the period when Lenora had been helping Wade with his personal and business finances, a period that June had been able to reconstruct not from direct knowledge, but from documents she had obtained through public records requests, and from a single conversation with a former colleague of Wade's who had retired to Bluffton and had his own reasons for remembering the details. The timeline began approximately 8.5 years ago. Lenora had approached Wade in her capacity as a financial administrator. That was the title she had used in her initial correspondence offering, to help him organize the accounts related to a residential development project he had been managing through a difficult second quarter. The project had been bleeding money. Wade had been too proud to ask for help through professional channels. Lenora had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right offer. 8 months later, she announced to my family that she was in love with him. June pointed to a line in the ledger that showed the date of Lenora's first documented involvement with Wade's accounts. She placed her finger beside it without speaking and let me read the entry myself. Then she turned to a second tabbed section and showed me the date of the dinner in my kitchen, the night Lenora had walked through my front door in my burgundy birthday dress and told my daughters that love has no blame. The gap between the two dates was exactly 34 weeks. Your sister did not fall in love with your husband, June said. Her voice was quiet and without inflection, the voice of someone delivering a measurement rather than a verdict. She audited him. She found a man who was drowning in debt, someone whose financial records were a mess and whose pride would keep him from asking for proper help. And she offered to be his accountant before she offered to be his lover. I sat with that for a moment. 8 years. I had spent 8 years believing that my marriage had ended because my younger sister had fallen into something she could not resist. I had been angry at the disorder of human feeling. I had understood it the way you understand a natural disaster not forgivable, but at least explicable. An accident of emotion. There was no accident. There had been a plan, and I had been inside it. "There is one more thing," June said. She closed the ledger and went back to the fireproof box. She removed a smaller envelope, letter-sized, and laid it on the table between us. Inside was a single printed page, a screenshot of an email thread. She explained that approximately 2 weeks before Wade died, he had placed a call to her the first time he had spoken to her in 15 years. He had been brief and careful on the phone. He had told her that Lenora had begun transferring funds from his personal accounts without authorization. He had told her that she had set up financial structures in his name that he had not approved and could not access. He had told her that he had engaged a lawyer and was preparing to file a complaint with the state attorney general's office. The printed page was a copy of the confirmation email from the lawyer's office. It acknowledged receipt of Wade's initial consultation request and confirmed a follow-up appointment. The appointment was scheduled for 5 days after Wade died. I looked at the date at the top of the email for a long time. "He died of a heart attack on a golf course," I said. My voice came out flat. "That is what the death certificate says," June replied. She did not add anything to that. She did not need to. The timeline held its own weight. The lawyer contacted, the appointment scheduled, the sudden death, and then Lenora moving with extraordinary speed in the weeks that followed, clearing out Wade's office, transferring the LLC filings into a new structure, accelerating the loan applications under my name before any audit window could open. "I am not saying she killed him," June said after a moment. "I am saying the timing is a miracle for a woman who does not believe in miracles." We sat at the kitchen table for a while after that without talking. The afternoon light moved across the floor from the window. One of the cats came in from the other room and settled on the bench near the back door. Outside, the vegetable garden was still in the heat. Eventually, I gathered my notebook and stood up. June walked me to the door, on the porch. She stopped me with a hand on my arm, not gripping, just present. "Be careful," she said, not because she is dangerous in the obvious way, because she is patient. I thanked her. I walked back down the dirt lane to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a few minutes watching the evening settle into the marsh on both sides of the lane, the light going gold, and then amber, and then a flat, cool gray. Then I picked up my phone and called a number in Savannah. It rang twice. A voice answered against the low background sounds of a hospital floor, beeping monitors, and the distant roll of a supply cart down a corridor. Mom, Bea said, there was a company registered in my name with $520,000 of defaulted commercial debt. Travis had filed a guardianship petition, and Grace had signed it. The assisted living facility had a room booked for me 30 days after the hearing. B did not speak for a long moment. I could hear the sounds of the hospital floor through the phone, the particular low hum of a space that runs without interruption at all hours. I am clocking out in 20 minutes, or psychikos, she said. I will be there by 2 a.m. She did not ask additional questions. She did not tell me to call the police or consult a lawyer or wait until daylight. She simply determined where she needed to be and gave me the time it would take to get there, the same way she might give a patient's family the timeline for a procedure. Steady, certain, without room for interpretation. The drive from Savannah to Charleston on Interstate 95 takes approximately 2 hours in light traffic. It was after 9 at night. B made it to June's house on Johns Island by 1:58 in the morning. June had not gone to sleep. She told me to come back inside while we waited. She cleared the kitchen table and set out 3 mugs and had a pot of coffee brewing on low heat. She sat reading at the table across from me, and neither of us spoke much while the marsh outside stayed dark and still. B came through the front door still wearing her scrubs, her hospital badge still clipped to the pocket. Her eyes were the particular kind of tired that comes from driving through the dark for 2 hours after working a full shift. But her posture was steady in the way that nurses' postures get steady after enough years of being the calmest person in a difficult room. She looked at me across the kitchen and put her arms around me before she said anything at all. I am sorry I was not closer, she said, into my hair. I am sorry I let that space stay open. I held on for a moment. Then we both sat down. June poured the coffee. It was strong and bitter, and it was exactly what was needed. B picked up the guardianship petition from the corner of the table where I had set it and read through the first several pages with an expression that reminded me of the way a mechanic looks at an engine that someone has tried to repair without knowing what they were doing. These symptom descriptions, she said. She tapped the page with one finger. They are copy-pasted from a clinical reference manual. The phrasing is textbook, and the progression described is not consistent with how cognitive decline actually presents. No licensed physician signed this filing. This is a layperson's interpretation of medical terminology. It would not hold up under any independent evaluation. She set the petition down and picked up the Magnolia Pines booking confirmation. She read it. She set it down. Then she picked it up again and looked at the date in the upper right corner of the document. She looked at the date stamp on the guardianship petition filing. She placed the 2 documents side by side on the table. The room was booked 3 weeks before he filed the petition, she said. Yes, I said. This was not a reaction to anything, B said. She looked up from the table. Her voice was quiet and absolute. This was a schedule. I had known that since I found the email. But hearing it said aloud, in the small kitchen of June's house on Johns Island at 2 a.m, gave it a different kind of weight. We stayed at the table for another hour. I explained everything I had found in Wade's email account. June laid out what she had reconstructed from the ledgers and the public records and the conversation with Wade's former colleague. B listened to all of it without interrupting, and when we were finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she did when she was organizing information into a sequence. 3 things, she said, bringing her gaze back down to the table. First, we get an independent cognitive evaluation done outside of Charleston. Somewhere Lenora does not have social connections or professional influence. I can arrange it through the hospital in Savannah. Second, June prepares the ledgers as formal exhibits with a written chain of custody. We need documented precedent that this pattern has happened before under Wade's management. Third, you trace the loan money. It did not disappear. It went somewhere: property, accounts, investments. Find where it landed. June nodded. I wrote the 3 points in the blue notebook and set the pen down on the page. We do it in that order, B said. The evaluation first. If we walk into a courtroom without that document, everything else we present will be filtered through the guardianship claim. The evaluation kills the claim before it starts. Everything else builds the case on top of it. Outside the kitchen window, the marsh was completely dark. The live oaks were silhouettes. The Spanish moss hung motionless in the still air. We sat for a while longer. No one felt the need to fill the quiet with reassurance. The plan was clear. The work was clear. There was nothing left to say that the work itself would not say better. Eventually, the sky beyond the marsh began to shift. Not light yet, but the particular pre-dawn quality of darkness that has started to let go of itself. June refilled our mugs. We drank. Then we stood up. The drive back to Charleston took 40 minutes in the early morning quiet. I dropped B at my house and drove to the county records office, arriving before the building opened and parking in the otherwise empty lot to wait. I had been inside county property records offices more times than I could count. Over the course of 38 years, the contents of those offices had told me the value of nearly 4,000 properties across Charleston County. I had learned to read the record books the way a physician reads a chart, not just for the numbers on the page, but for what the sequence of those numbers revealed about the decisions being made above them. That morning, I was not reading for value. I was reading for movement. The records clerk opened the building at 8:30 and did not visibly react to the fact that I was the only person in the parking lot when the doors unlocked. I signed in, stated my professional license number out of habit, and then remembered that the license was currently suspended. I stated it anyway. The clerk did not check. I sat at one of the long wooden research tables and pulled 3 filing trays of deed transfer records that corresponded to the property addresses I had identified from the loan applications in Wade's email account. The addresses had been listed as collateral in the commercial loan filings. 4 parcels on the western periphery of North Charleston, and 2 in the outlying areas south of the urban core. I worked through the deed transfers in chronological order. Each parcel had been purchased within a 6-month window, following the initial disbursement of the corresponding loan. The buyer listed on each deed was Dorothy Hensley Property Solutions, LLC. The purchase prices were modest, the kind of prices that pass without scrutiny in a market where land values fluctuate by neighborhood and by season, and by which projects happen to be moving through the Planning Commission at any given time. Within 18 months of each purchase, every parcel had been transferred again. The receiving entity in each case was a second limited liability company, registered under a different name. I noted the entity name and the registration number and wrote them in my blue notebook. I went to the State Business Registration database on the Records Office computer and looked up the second entity. 2 members were listed. Lenora Hensley held 60% of the membership interest. Travis Caldwell held 40%. I wrote those numbers down and underlined them twice. I pulled the current estimated values for all 6 parcels from the most recent county assessment rolls. Assessed values lag behind market values, but they provide a flora-conservative baseline from which real market value can be extrapolated by someone who has spent decades doing exactly that. The assessed value of the combined parcels was $1,800,000. The original purchase price, funded entirely by the loans registered under my name, had been just under $460,000. I closed the assessment folder and sat with the numbers for a moment. The loans had not simply transferred debt to my name. They had purchased assets that were now worth approximately 4 times what was paid for them assets that had been quietly moved into an entity, controlled entirely by Lenora and Travis, while the debt remained entirely attached to me. I also noticed something that required the kind of eye you develop only by standing on a great many pieces of ground over a great many years. I asked the clerk for a regional planning commission map from the current cycle. I spread the map across the research table and located each of the 6 parcels. I marked them with small circles using a pencil borrowed from the clerk. When I stepped back and looked at the overall pattern, the 6 circles formed a rough arc along the western boundary of a corridor that the city had designated for expanded mixed-use development in the current municipal planning cycle. The parcels did not sit inside the development corridor. They sat along the edge of it, positioned in exactly the location where infrastructure investment would increase surrounding land values within 3 to 5 years. Whoever had selected those parcels had known what the Planning Commission was going to approve before the approval was public record. Travis worked at a bank. Banks receive early notification of municipal infrastructure financing packages. He had known exactly what to buy and when to buy it. I drove back to June's house and spread everything on the kitchen table. June and Bea had been working while I was at the records office. June, organizing the ledgers into a formal exhibit sequence. Bea compiling a summary of the guardianship petition's medical deficiencies for the independent evaluator. We spent an hour laying out the complete timeline in sequence. By the time we finished, the picture was clear and complete, and not a single element of it was speculative. Every piece had a document. My phone rang as I was writing the final entry in my notebook. It was Bea, calling from the other side of the table. I looked up. "Doctor, Patterson in Savannah," she said, without waiting for me to answer. "She agreed to take you tomorrow morning. Full cognitive evaluation, expedited." I also ran into someone from Travis's bank at the hospital cafeteria this morning. a woman from the commercial lending division. She said Travis has been telling people at the bank about a property deal that will make him financially independent before the end of the quarter. I set my pen down. Before the end of the quarter, I repeated. The hearing is scheduled for the Thursday of the third week, B said. I looked at the map on the table, the 6 pencil circles along the development corridor, the assessment values, the deed transfers. He was planning to flip the land before the guardianship hearing closed. He needed the hearing to go through first, so that the debt attached to the parcel's original purchase entity, which still bore my name, could be formally assigned to a guardian-controlled account. Once that happened, the debt would be manageable and the assets would be untouchable. He had built a system, and he had given himself a deadline. We now had both. The neurology clinic sat on a quiet side street in Savannah's medical district, 3 blocks east of the hospital where B worked. We arrived at 8 in the morning. The waiting room was small and impersonal, with rows of molded plastic chairs, in a color that the manufacturer probably called sand, but that the fluorescent lights overhead turned into something more, like the inside of an old envelope. B had driven. She had worked a full night shift after the drive to John's Island and the hours at June's kitchen table, and she had been awake for well over 24 hours. But she had insisted on driving and would not hear otherwise. She sat beside me in the waiting room with her hospital badge still on, her hands folded in her lap, and she did not try to fill the silence with reassurance. That was something I had always appreciated about B. She understood that some rooms are better left quiet. Doctor, Patterson's assistant called my name at 8:20. The doctor herself appeared 10 minutes later, a compact woman in her mid-50s with a direct gaze and a manner that reminded me of the better organized county assessors I had worked with over the years. She reviewed the referral notes B had submitted, asked me a few preliminary questions about my sleep and diet and stress levels over the past several weeks, and then began the evaluation. The assessment took 2 hours and 20 minutes. It covered a full range of cognitive domains, orientation to time and place, short and long-term memory recall, executive function, abstract reasoning, language processing, and visuospatial skills. There were written portions and verbal portions. There were timed tests and untimed tests. At one point, Dr. Patterson placed a series of geometric patterns on the table in front of me and asked me to identify the underlying logic. I told her the answer before she had finished arranging the shapes. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses for a moment. "You have done something like this before," she said. I told her that property appraisals require pattern recognition, logical sequencing, and the ability to hold multiple variables in relation to each other simultaneously. I told her that I had been doing it 5 days a week for 38 years. She wrote something on her notepad and continued. When the evaluation was finished, she asked me to wait in the examination room while she reviewed the scoring. I sat in the paper-covered chair and looked at the framed anatomy chart on the wall. Outside the window, a single magnolia tree was losing its last summer blooms to the heat. I thought about the guardianship petition sitting in a manila folder in my tote bag, which described me as a woman experiencing progressive cognitive deterioration. Doctor. Patterson returned 20 minutes later. She sat down across from me and placed the report on the desk between us. Your cognitive function scores are in the 93rd percentile for your age group, she said. Her voice was even and matter of fact, the voice of someone who delivers assessments without editorializing. You are performing at a level that is sharper than the majority of my patients who are half your age. Whoever filed this guardianship petition either has no legitimate medical basis for doing so, or they have a very different motive than concern for your welfare. She signed the report. She pressed the hospital seal into the lower right corner of the final page. If this ends up in a courtroom, she said, the document holds. I thanked her. I carried the report out through the waiting room and into the morning air, where the August heat had already started its work on the day. B was waiting outside, sitting on a low concrete wall near the parking area with a paper cup of coffee she had found somewhere. She stood up when she saw me come through the door. I handed her the report without saying anything. She read the first page. She read the summary on the last page. Then she lowered the papers and looked at me. 93rd percentile, she said. Apparently, I am sharper than most people half my age, I said. She let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one either of us had managed in several days. Then she looked down at the report again, and the expression shifted into something quieter and more complicated. I should have been here, she said, when all of this started happening. I should have been the first call you made, not the last one. I did not argue with her. She was right about the math, but she was wrong about the weight of it. You were a 4-hour drive away, and you left before 2 a.m. without asking a single question. I said, you are here now. That is the only appraisal that matters. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took my hand, the way she used to when she was young, simply and without announcement, the way children hold on to the things they love before they learn that it requires an occasion. We walked to the car. On the drive back toward Charleston, my phone buzzed on the center console. A text message from June. It read, Travis filed an emergency motion this morning to expedite the hearing. The court approved it. Hearing is scheduled for Thursday of next week. 4 days. I set the phone down on the seat beside me. I looked out the passenger window at the marshland moving past, the cordgrass catching the morning light, the same way it had caught it on the drive down 2 days before. 4 days. I reached into my tote bag and took out the blue notebook. I opened it to the page with B's 3 points. I had checked off 2 of them. 1 remained. We had 4 days to use it. What happened in Grace's house 4 nights before the hearing? I was not there to witness. I know it the way I know all the things I was not present for, but needed to understand because Grace told me every detail herself, and she told it in the precise order it occurred, with the careful exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something too long and finally has permission to set it down. It is the kind of story that begins in the dark and ends in the kitchen. And I want to tell it the way she gave it to me. She had not been sleeping well since the day she signed the petition. She described lying in bed each night and staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she shared with Travis, trying to locate the source of the discomfort that had been sitting in her chest, like a stone she could not identify by shape or name. She had told herself it was guilt about me. She had told herself it was grief about the family situation. She had told herself it was the particular anxiety of watching someone you love decline. But discomfort that has a name eventually resolves. The thing in her chest had no name, and it did not resolve. On that Sunday night, 4 nights before the scheduled hearing, she lay in bed with her eyes closed when Travis got up. She heard him cross the room. She heard him step into the hallway. She heard him pull the bedroom door almost shut, but not entirely. The latch did not catch, and the gap he left was barely the width of 2 fingers. She heard him dial. She heard 1 ring before the other line connected. "The guardianship clears Thursday," Travis said. His voice was low and measured, the professional voice he used at the bank, the voice she had never heard him use for personal calls. "Once it goes through, we move on the house first. The old woman's place should clear $300,000 in this market, maybe more if we time the listing right. She does not need a 4-bedroom house. She needs a bed with rails and a window she cannot open." Grace said she did not move. She said her body simply stopped, the way a machine stops when something essential inside it fails. She heard Lenora's laugh the light, easy laugh she had heard at every holiday table for as long as she could remember. "Just make sure Grace signs the power of attorney paperwork before she starts asking the wrong questions," Lenora said. "That girl is as naive as her mother used to be. She will do whatever you tell her as long as you hold her hand while you are saying it." Grace told me she lay in the dark for a long time after Travis came back to bed, and the house went quiet again. She said she felt something leave her, not all at once, the way dramatic things are supposed to happen, but slowly, the way warmth leaves a room when the heat goes off in the night. By morning, the feeling was entirely gone, and what replaced it was something she did not have a word for. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was clarity. Travis left for work at 7:15. Grace waited until his car turned off the end of the street. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the spot where the car had been until she was certain it was not coming back. She got Harper up and dressed, fixed her daughter's braids, and poured a glass of juice she did not drink herself. She loaded Harper into the back seat, buckled the car seat, and drove across the north side of Charleston to the house I had lived in for 19 years. She knocked on my door. I had been awake since 5. Sitting at the kitchen table with the blue notebook and the documents spread out in front of me. When I opened the door and saw her face, I understood immediately that something had broken open. She was standing on the front step with Harper's hand in hers. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed from a night without sleep, and she wore the particular expression of someone who has made a decision they cannot take back and is standing at the first moment of living with it. "I heard them, Mom," she said. "I heard everything. I am so sorry." Harper let go of her mother's hand and walked through the door and wrapped both arms around my legs without a word. I put my hand on the back of her head. I looked at my older daughter over the top of her granddaughter's braided hair. I opened the door wider. Grace stepped inside. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She reached into her purse and placed her phone on the table between us. She opened the recording application. She pressed play. I listened to 37 seconds of Travis's voice in the dark, calling me the old woman, describing the house I had paid off over 30 years as an asset to be timed and listed. I listened to Lenora's laugh. I listened to her call my daughter naive. I asked Grace to play it again. I had spent the previous week reading property records and tracking loan disbursements and mapping 6 pencil circles on a planning commission map. All of it had been precise and necessary and completely bloodless. This was different. This was my daughter lying awake in a dark room, hearing the 2 people who were supposed to love her, most treating her as a secondary consideration in a financial transaction. I did not look at Grace while we listened. I looked at the table. When it was finished, Grace said, "Tell me what I need to do." I looked at her for a moment, at the tiredness in her face and the steadiness behind it. I picked up the blue notebook. I turned to the page with B's 3 points. I set it on the table in front of her. "We go to court," I said, "together." The Charleston County Family Court building sits on Broad Street, 6 blocks from the waterfront, between a parking garage and a coffee shop that opens at 6 in the morning and has a line out the door by 7:30. I had driven past it hundreds of times in 38 years without ever needing to go inside. The building is not imposing. It is beige brick and tinted glass, the kind of architecture that communicates function without ceremony, which is either honest or depressing depending on what you are going in for. We arrived at 8:45. I had asked everyone to be early. June wore a dark blazer I had not seen before and carried the exhibit folders in a leather portfolio she had brought from a filing cabinet in her house. She did not speak on the drive over, and she did not speak in the parking garage, and she did not speak walking across the plaza, which was appropriate because there was nothing left to say that the documents would not say more clearly. B had borrowed a blazer from a colleague at the hospital. She wore it over her civilian clothes, and she had put her hair up, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had driven through the night and worked without sleeping, and believed completely in the outcome of what she was walking into. Grace had Harper by the hand. Harper was wearing the yellow cardigan. Grace had dressed herself simply in slacks and a blouse, and she walked with a stillness that I had never seen in her before, the particular stillness that appears in people who have recently exchanged confusion for conviction. I wore the blazer I had been wearing to appraisals for the better part of 2 decades. Gray wool. The elbows had been relined once. I carried 3 manila folders against my chest, and I wore my hair pulled back the same way I wore it to every property walk-through I had done for 38 years. I was not dressed for a performance. I was dressed for work. We passed through the security checkpoint in a row, placed our bags on the conveyor belt, and reassembled on the other side. The security officer did not look up from his screen. The family court hearing rooms were on the second floor. We took the stairs. Room 214 was at the end of a corridor that smelled of old carpet and institutional cleaning solution. The door was open. I paused outside for exactly one breath and then walked in. The room was small and plain in the way that family courts often are not the vaulted wood-paneled courtrooms that appear in films, but a working room with fluorescent panel lights, laminate tables in a light oak finish, and a state flag in the corner that needed pressing. There were 2 rows of gallery seats in the back. Most were empty. Travis sat at the table on the right side of the room. He was wearing a charcoal suit I had not seen before, and his posture carried the particular confidence of a man who has done his preparation and expects the outcome he prepared for. Beside him sat an attorney from the firm on Broad Street, a man in his 40s with the practiced stillness of someone who has spent a career delivering outcomes in rooms exactly like this one. He had a leather briefcase, a yellow legal pad, and a fountain pen that he was rotating slowly between his fingers. Lenora occupied the first row of gallery seats directly behind Travis. She was dressed in a black wrap dress, and she wore her hair down, and she had on the expression I had seen on her face at funerals: attentive, somber, entirely prepared to communicate suffering to anyone who happened to look in her direction. When I walked in, she looked up. Her eyes moved from my face to Grace's face, to Harper's hand in Grace's hand. Something shifted in her expression, briefly, and then not at all. Judge Harrison entered from the side door at 9 o'clock precisely. She was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the demeanor of someone who has heard every version of every family story available in the state of South Carolina, and is waiting to determine which version is supported by paper. She sat down. She opened the file in front of her. Travis's attorney stood first. He spoke for 18 minutes. He described me as a woman exhibiting cognitive decline that had manifested in paranoid financial delusions, social isolation, and behavior inconsistent with my professional capacity. He presented a summary of behaviors: the licensing complaint, the disrupted pickup arrangement, the concerned communications from family members. He referred to the assisted living facility reservation as evidence of proactive family planning. He did not describe it as evidence of a predetermined schedule. His voice was smooth and measured and entirely removed from the situation, in the way that professional voices become when they have presented the same material enough times. He looked at Judge Harrison, not at me, for the full 18 minutes. Lenora dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief once during the attorney's presentation. Travis did not move. He looked straight ahead at the judge's bench. When the attorney finished and sat down, the room was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The state flag hung in its corner. Outside the second-floor window, the late morning sky was a flat, hazy blue. Judge Harrison adjusted her reading glasses. She looked at the table on my side of the room at June with her leather portfolio, at Bea with her borrowed blazer, at Grace with Harper seated quietly beside her, at me with 3 manila folders on the table in front of me. "Mrs. Hensley," she said. Her voice was neither warm nor cold. It was the voice of a courtroom, which is to say it was entirely neutral and entirely attentive. "Do you wish to respond?" I stood up. There was no attorney standing beside me. There were no legal briefs prepared by a firm with 4 names on the letterhead. There were 3 manila folders and 38 years of knowing how to read a document. "Your Honor," I said, "I have been a licensed property appraiser in the state of South Carolina for 38 years. In that time, I have assessed the value of nearly 4,000 properties across this county. I know how to read value. I also know how to read fraud." I opened the first folder and placed the document on the judge's side of the table. I did not walk it over. I slid it across with the same steady hand I used to pass appraisal reports to mortgage officers for 3 decades. "Exhibit 1, I said. "This is an independent cognitive assessment completed 4 days ago at a Savannah neurology clinic. The evaluating physician, Dr. Patterson, is the chief of neurology at the medical center where my daughter B works. The report documents my cognitive function scores at the 93rd percentile for my age group. Dr. Patterson notes that I perform at a level that exceeds the majority of her patients who are half my age. The report also states that whoever filed this guardianship petition either has no legitimate medical basis for doing so or has a very different motive than concern for my welfare." Judge Harrison picked up the report. She read it. She set it down. "Exhibit 2. I placed the second folder's contents on the table. The deed transfers, the LLC registrations, the assessed values, June's ledger excerpts. These are property records from the Charleston County Records Office and corresponding documents from the State Business Registration Database. The commercial loans filed under my name as collateral were used to purchase 6 parcels of land in and around North Charleston, within 18 months of each purchase. Every parcel was transferred to a second limited liability company. Lenora Hensley holds 60% of that company. Travis Caldwell holds 40%. The original purchase price of those parcels, funded entirely by loans registered under my name, was just under $460,000. Their current assessed value is $1,800,000. Travis's attorney shifted in his seat. He began to rise. Judge Harrison raised one hand without looking at him, and he sat back down. Also included in Exhibit 2, I continued, are ledger records kept by June Purcell, the sister of my former husband. These records document a pattern of financial fraud conducted under my former husband's management, beginning 15 years ago, a pattern that uses a secondary party's identity to register commercial entities and absorb debt. The pattern in my former husband's records is structurally identical to what has been applied to my name. I set the second folder down and picked up the third. Exhibit 3. I placed the Magnolia Pines booking confirmation on the table. This is an email confirmation from Magnolia Pines Assisted Living in North Charleston. It confirms a reservation for a single occupancy room made in my name. The reservation was made 11 weeks ago, 3 weeks before Travis Caldwell filed this guardianship petition. The primary contact on the reservation is Travis Caldwell. The billing contact is Lenora Hensley. The payment source is listed. In the facility's own words, as sale proceeds from patient's primary residence. The room was very quiet. This was not proactive family planning, I said. This was a schedule. Grace rose from the chair beside me before I had finished sitting down. She did not look at Travis. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "I am the person who signed the supporting documentation for this petition. I signed it because I was deceived about the nature of what I was supporting. I formally and completely withdraw my consent." She reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table in front of Judge Harrison. 4 nights ago, I recorded a conversation between my husband and my aunt that I believe is relevant to the court's evaluation of this petition's intent. Judge Harrison looked at the phone. She looked at Travis. She looked at the phone again. Then she pressed play. Travis's voice came through the small speaker with the particular flatness of a recording made in a dark room. 300,000 in this market, a bed with rails, a window she cannot open. And then Lenora's laugh, unhurried and easy, followed by her voice saying naive as her mother used to be. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. No one in the room moved. When the recording ended, Judge Harrison set the phone down on the table. She took her reading glasses off the chain and put them on. She looked at Travis. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "did you book a room at Magnolia Pines Assisted Living before filing this guardianship petition?" Travis turned to his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. Neither of them said anything. "Petition denied," Judge Harrison said. Her voice did not change in tone or volume. It remained the voice of a courtroom, which is steady and sufficient for every occasion. "I am referring this matter to the South Carolina State Attorney General for investigation into elder financial abuse and fraudulent use of legal process." She closed the file. Lenora stood up from her gallery seat. Her mouth opened. I watched her from across the room, and for the first time in my life I saw her, without a word to deliver. Not a performance, not a deflection, not a prepared expression of sorrow or patience. Just a woman standing in a courthouse with nothing left to say. Harper slid off her chair and crossed the floor and wrapped both arms around my legs for the second time in a week. I put my hand on the back of her head and looked at my daughters over the top of her braids. We walked out of the courtroom and down the corridor and through the courthouse doors. The August sun hit my face. The harbor was 3 blocks away. The city was exactly as it had always been, and I was still in it, and the house was still mine. The legal system does not move the way the tides move. It does not sweep in and retreat with the moon. It operates the way a contractor rehabilitates a condemned building, methodically, in phases, on a schedule determined by inspectors rather than by the people who have been waiting outside on the sidewalk. The weeks after the hearing moved that way. Travis Caldwell was placed on administrative leave from the bank on the same afternoon that Judge Harrison's referral reached the state attorney general's office. His commercial lending credentials were suspended pending investigation. The land deal he had been planning to execute before the end of the quarter was frozen along with every other asset he held jointly with the LLC that bore Lenora's name and his. The parcels sat where they were, neither sold nor transferred. While the investigators worked through the documentation, the bank conducted its own internal review. Banks are not in the habit of allowing their commercial lending officers to originate fraudulent loans using third-party identities. The review confirmed what the county records already showed. Travis resigned before the formal termination was completed, which saved no one anything and resolved nothing, but was the kind of move that people like Travis make because they believe it preserves the appearance of choice. It did not. Grace filed for divorce 11 days after the hearing. She came to my house on the morning she filed and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Harper in the high chair beside her, and she did not cry. She told me what the attorney had advised. She told me the timeline. Then she asked me if I had any biscuits, and I did. And we ate them at the table together while Harper ate her toast and talked to herself about a show she had watched that morning. Within the month, Grace and Harper moved into a rental house 2 streets over from mine. It was a small house, 1 story, with a yard that backed up to the same greenway that ran behind my property. On mornings when the weather permitted, which in Charleston in the early autumn is most mornings, Harper walked through the greenway to my back gate and let herself in with the latch code I had written on a piece of paper and taped to the inside of her lunchbox. The South Carolina State Attorney General's office filed charges against Lenora in October: forgery, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. The assets attached to the LLC were seized pursuant to the investigation. The land parcels were inventoried and placed under injunction. Lenora retained an attorney. The attorney issued a statement that his client maintained her innocence. The statement did not receive the kind of coverage that the original booking confirmation had received when the judge read it into the court record. Separately, the state medical examiner's office received a formal request from the Attorney General to review the circumstances of Wade Hensley's death. The request cited newly surfaced financial documentation suggesting a potential conflict of interest in the timeline of events preceding his cardiac event. I did not follow that process closely. I had not loved Wade Hensley for a very long time, and I had not hated him either. I had simply been trying to understand what had happened to my name, and the investigation would determine what the investigation would determine. The South Carolina Real Estate Appraiser Licensing Board reinstated my license in September. The reinstatement letter arrived on a Tuesday, the same kind of Tuesday the first suspension letter had arrived on, and I read it at the same kitchen table. The letter was 2 paragraphs. I folded it and put it in the drawer beside the sink where I kept my notebook and my professional reference files and a takeout menu I had been meaning to throw away for 3 years. The commercial debt was resolved over the course of 6 weeks following the hearing. The forgery documentation I had presented in court, combined with the digital records from Wade's email account and the structural analysis prepared by the Attorney General's team, was sufficient to establish that the loans had been originated fraudulently. The lenders submitted the appropriate filings. The shadow company was formally decoupled from my legal identity. My credit profile was restored. $520,000 of debt that I had never created, attached to a company I had never formed, carrying an employer identification number I had never signed for, simply ceased to exist. June Purcell drove across the Stono River Bridge and came to my house for the first time in the 15 years since the family had erased her from their gatherings. She brought a container of something she had made with tomatoes from her garden, and she sat in the kitchen and we talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular, about Charleston and the summer heat and the condition of the roads on John's Island and the habits of her cats. When she left, she said she would come back the following week. She did. B submitted a transfer request to a hospital in Charleston 2 weeks after the hearing. The transfer was approved in October. She found a small apartment on the east side of the city, close enough to drive to my house in 12 minutes when the traffic was light. She called me more than she used to. I answered every time. The autumn moved through Charleston the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, the temperatures dropping by degrees rather than all at once, the oak trees holding their leaves longer than the trees up north ever would. The rose garden went into its seasonal dormancy. The cordgrass in the lowlands shifted from pale gold to a deeper amber. The harbor water turned a darker shade of blue. I sat on my front porch on a Saturday afternoon in early November and watched the light move across my yard. And I thought about the first letter that had arrived in this mailbox at the end of the previous summer, tucked between a water bill and a grocery store coupon. The mailbox was empty. Everything I needed was already inside the house. The best Sundays in my house have always smelled the same. Butter melting into hot cast iron, coffee brewing on the back burner, the particular warmth that comes when an oven has been on for an hour, and the kitchen windows begin to fog at the edges. For most of my life, that smell had been the province of quiet mornings. One mug, one chair, the radio on low. The smell was good regardless, but it is a different thing entirely when there are other people in it with you. Harper was on her high chair at the end of the table. She had been helping with the biscuit dough, which in practice meant she had pressed both palms flat into the mixing bowl and then flat onto the table. And there was flour across her nose and in her eyebrows, and she was entirely unbothered by this. She was narrating something to herself in the unbroken, confident monologue of a child who has not yet discovered that her inner life is private. Grace was at the sink, rinsing the mixing bowls. She had her hair up, and she was wearing a sweater I recognized as one she had borrowed from my closet 2 weeks ago and had apparently decided to keep. I did not mention this. She was humming something without knowing she was humming on the laptop propped against the fruit bowl on the counter. B was visible in the small rectangle of the video call. She was in the break room at the hospital, eating a container of yogurt and keeping one eye on the doorway in case her name was called. She was 40 minutes from the end of a Saturday night shift. She waved at Harper, and Harper waved back without interrupting her monologue. June had arrived at 9:30 with a cloth bag that held a round container of tomato soup she had made from the last of her garden tomatoes, and she was sitting at the table across from Harper with her hands folded around her coffee mug, watching the child with the quiet attention of someone who has learned not to take the ordinary things for granted. I took the biscuits out of the oven and set the pan on the wire rack and stood at the counter for a moment. I had spent 38 years walking into other people's houses and determining their value. I had stood in empty kitchens and measured square footage and noted the condition of appliances and assessed the quality of the natural light. I had written numbers on clipboards and delivered them to banks, and those numbers had determined whether families could stay in the places they called home. I had never once turned that process on my own kitchen. I looked at the pan of biscuits. I looked at the flour on my granddaughter's nose. I looked at my older daughter's borrowed sweater and my younger daughter waving from a break room 40 minutes away. I looked at June Purcell, who had driven across a bridge and come back after 15 years with a container of soup, and who was now just a woman sitting at a kitchen table watching a child eat breakfast. Whatever the number was, it was more than I knew how to write on a clipboard. The doorbell rang. Grace turned from the sink. Bea looked up from her yogurt on the screen. June did not move. Harper looked at the door and then looked back at her toast. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked down the hallway. I opened the front door. Lenora stood on the front step. She was not wearing the black wrap dress from the courthouse. She was not wearing anything I recognized. Her clothes were wrinkled in the way that clothes get when they have been slept in more than once. Her hair was down and uncombed. She was not wearing any makeup, and without it, her face looked different, smaller, somehow, and older, and entirely without the particular armor that she had maintained for as long as I had known her as an adult. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed in the way that eyes get after several consecutive days of not sleeping enough or crying too much or both. She looked at me. "I have nowhere else to go. Dorothy," she said. Her voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. I stood in the doorway and looked at my sister for a long moment. I looked at the hollows under her eyes. I looked at the wrinkled collar of her shirt. I looked past her shoulder at the street behind her, the empty November street, the bare oak trees, the pale gray sky, the same neighborhood I had been living in for 19 years, while she had lived 3 miles away and come no closer. "You have exactly the same number of places I had," I said. "The day you walked into my kitchen wearing my birthday dress and told my daughters that love has no blame. Figure it out. Lenora." I closed the door. I did not close it hard. I closed it the way you close a door at the end of a day when everything that needed to be done has been done with a steady hand and no particular emotion. Just the quiet, mechanical fact of a latch engaging in its frame. I heard her footsteps on the front steps. I heard them on the front walk. Then I did not hear them anymore. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I turned around and walked back to the kitchen. Harper was looking at me from her high chair with the wide and interested expression of a child who has noted that something occurred but does not yet have the language for what kind of thing it was. "Who was at the door?" "Grandma," she asked. I picked up a clean dish towel. I reached across the table and wiped the flour off the end of her nose. She held very still while I did it, the way she always did, with her eyes on my face. "Nobody important, sweetheart," I said. I put the biscuits on the table. I sit on my front porch most evenings when the weather allows, which in Charleston in the autumn means almost every evening from September through November. I have a chair out here that has been on this porch since the second year I lived in this house. A wooden rocker with a cushion I have replaced twice, and a loose spindle on the right side that I keep meaning to fix and somehow never do. Harper is asleep inside. The house is quiet in the particular way houses get when a child has gone to bed. A soft, alert quiet, different from the quiet of an empty house. I look at the rose garden. It went dormant in October, the way it does every year. The canes are bare now, cut back for the season, and from the porch they look like nothing more than a few sticks in the ground. There is no way to tell by looking at them what they will be in April. You have to know the history. You have to know what has come up here before and what this particular patch of ground is capable of producing when the conditions are right. I spent 38 years appraising other people's houses. I walked through front doors and measured square footage and wrote numbers on clipboards, and those numbers meant something to the families who were waiting for them. I was good at the work. I am grateful for the work. But I never once applied the same method to my own life until someone tried to take it from me. It turns out that the tools work just as well when the property is your own. What I learned over the past year, really learned. Not the kind of learning that sits in the front of your mind and sounds right when you say it, but the kind that settles into your bones and changes how you move through the world, is that the value of a thing and the price of a thing are not the same. They never were. I spent a career teaching that principle to mortgage officers and bank examiners and first-time buyers who could not understand why a house on a good street was worth more than its square footage suggested. The same is true for a life. The real value of what I have is not in the square footage of this house, or the balance of my reinstated savings account, or the number on the appraisal reports I will go back to writing next week. The real value is in the biscuit dough on my granddaughter's nose. It is in the sound of my younger daughter's voice on a phone she picks up every time I call. It is in the steadiness of June Purcell, who kept 15 years of ledgers in a filing cabinet on an island because she believed the truth deserved to be preserved even when no one was asking for it. It is in the 4 hours Bea drove through the dark without asking a single question first. I believe these things are gifts. I believe they were placed in my life by something larger than accident, and I am grateful to God for every one of them in a way that goes deeper than words. I also believe that I nearly lost all of it, not because I was careless, but because I was raised to extend the benefit of the doubt to the people I loved, and I extended it past the point where the evidence required a different response. That is the thing that people like Lenora understand about people like me. They know that the same quality that makes you capable of loyalty makes you capable of being exploited. They count on it. They count on you choosing kindness over clarity again and again until the gap between what you know and what you are willing to act on becomes large enough for them to move through. The way to close that gap is not to become someone who does not trust. It is to become someone who reads the evidence. I am an appraiser. I should have been reading the evidence all along. I know how to identify a structural flaw beneath a fresh coat of paint. I know how to look at a property that has been staged to appear sound and find the places where the foundation is compromised. I had that skill for 38 years, and I applied it to every house I was hired to evaluate. and I somehow never thought to apply it at home. The people in my life who tried to erase me were counting on that oversight. They were also, as it turned out, counting on June staying quiet on John's Island. They were counting on Bee staying in Savannah. They were counting on Grace staying in the dark. They were counting on the truth staying in cardboard boxes instead of on a courtroom table. None of those things held. I think about the 15 years June spent preserving her ledgers. I think about the day she opened that fireproof box and set those binders on her kitchen table between us. She had been waiting for that day for a very long time, not with bitterness, as far as I could tell, but with the patient certainty of someone who trusts that God has a longer memory than circumstance. God knows I am not a patient woman by nature, but I learned something this year about what patience actually is. It is not the absence of urgency. It is the decision to move at the speed the evidence requires, rather than the speed the panic demands. The rose canes in the garden look like nothing right now. By April, they will look like everything. The ground remembers. I stand up from the rocker. I go inside and lock the front door. I stand in the kitchen and look at the biscuit pan on the counter, Harper's high chair at the end of the table, the grocery list on the refrigerator that has Wednesday's school pickup time written at the top. Everything in its place, everything I built, still standing. I turn off the kitchen light and go to bed. You have been with me through every room of this story. You sat with me in the bank parking lot when I first read that letter. You stood with me outside the school fence on a Wednesday afternoon and watched my granddaughter wave from over a man's shoulder. You were in the kitchen when I sat down on the floor, and in the kitchen again when I stood back up. You drove with me across the Stono River Bridge. You sat at June's small table in the dark at 2 a.m. while we went through the documents. You were in the courthouse when Judge Harrison said the words that closed the petition, and you were on the front porch when I closed a different kind of door. I do not take that lightly. Spending your time with someone else's story is an act of trust, and I want to honor it before we finish. You did not have to stay. You stayed anyway. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in what I have described, not the specific details, but the feeling underneath them, I want you to hear this clearly. The feeling that something is wrong, but you cannot name it. The experience of being slowly cut off from the things and people that give your life its shape. The particular exhaustion of being told, again and again, that the reality you are experiencing is not the reality that is actually happening. I want you to know that you are not losing your mind. What you are experiencing has a name. What is being done to you has a name. And the people doing it are counting on the possibility that you will never look for either one. Do not let the panic set the pace. I know how it feels when everything begins to move. At once the phone calls, the documents, the accounts, the legal paperwork arriving before the coffee gets cold. I know how it feels when the people who were supposed to love you turn out to be the ones who built the maze. The instinct in that moment is to run, to react, to match their speed. That instinct is what they are designing for. Slow down, not because the situation is not serious, because seriousness requires accuracy, and accuracy requires time that panic will not give you. Look for the structural flaw. It is always there. A lie requires constant maintenance to survive, and that maintenance leaves marks the way every renovation leaves marks, in the dates that do not line up, in the signatures that look almost right but not quite, in the zip codes from the wrong year, and the documents that describe events that happened on days when you were somewhere else entirely. Read the fine print. Keep the receipts. Find the June Purcell in your life, the person who saw what was happening before you did, who kept the records when no one else thought they were worth keeping, who is waiting on the other side of a bridge you have not crossed yet, because no one told you it was there. And when you find her, drive across that bridge. Bring your notebook and the documents you have already gathered. What you carry into that meeting matters. Documentation does not age. Your memory of the conversation will fade. The paper will not. I want to say one more thing about the women who showed up for me during the hardest year I have known. June, who preserved the truth for 15 years in a fireproof box because she understood that documented evidence outlasts the people who created it. B, who clocked out of a night shift and drove 4 hours through the dark on the strength of 4 sentences. Grace, who spent a sleepless night in the dark with the knowledge that the person she had trusted with her loyalty had called her mother the old woman, and who chose in the morning to get her daughter dressed and drive across the city. These women are not extraordinary in the way that stories sometimes require people to be extraordinary. They are ordinary women who chose, at the moment that mattered, to do the one thing they were capable of doing. June had her ledgers. B had her car keys. Grace had her phone recording and the clarity that comes after a very long night. You do not need to be exceptional to change what is happening to you. You need to know what you have and to use it. I am an appraiser. For 38 years, my job was to determine the value of other people's property. The most important thing I learned in that time is this: the value of a thing is not assigned by the people who want to take it from you. It is inherent. It was there before they arrived, and it will be there after they are gone. Your worth is not a number that someone else gets to write in a box. Your ledger belongs to you. If this story reached you today, if something in Dorothy Hensley's kitchen, or Dorothy Hensley's courthouse, or Dorothy Hensley's rose garden found something in your own life and named it, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of this story sat with you. Tell me where you are in your own ledger. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. This channel is built for the women who have been told they are imagining things, who have been told their records are wrong, who have been told their feelings are the problem. It is built for the women who kept their notebooks and their biscuit recipes and their dignity through circumstances that would have required most people to surrender, at least one of the 3. The ground remembers what it has grown. So do you. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.